Hello everyone, my name is JKing. The country that I've chosen to do my project on is Japan. So why Japan? In post-World War II Japan, Japanese companies visited America to observe automotive manufacturing. Most famous, Aja Toyota and Kachi Ono from the Toyota Motor Corporation observed Henry Ford's automotive assembly plant in Detroit, Michigan, which inspired them to create their own production system, later to be known as the Toyota Production System. TPS's main components are focused on eliminating waste, creating value for the customer, and continually improving processes through employee involvement. The Japanese word Kaizen, which translates to change for the better or continuous improvements, becomes widely known, and the Japanese style of manufacturing becomes popular in the U.S. Modern lean production is based on the Toyota production system and is now used throughout the world. General facts. Japan is an island country located off the coast of Southeast Asia in the Pacific Ocean. Japan's closest neighbors are the Republic of Korea, China, and Russia. Japan has a land size of 145,936 square kilometers. Japan's population is 126,700,000 people. The national currency is the yen. Main industries in Japan are automobiles, consumer electronics, computers, and other electronics. Japan has the third largest economy behind the United States and China. The GDP in US dollars is 4.4 trillion. And the GDP per capita in US dollars is $34,522 per household as of 2015. So some important facts that we're going to discuss in more detail throughout this presentation. We're going to look at two things. We're going to look at the culture of Japan being overworked. We see that Japan is second behind South Korea in annual average hours worked in these selected countries. We see United States fourth in this list. Another aspect of the Japanese culture that we're going to look at is the culture of gift giving. Japanese gift giving is part of the Japanese culture and is considered a local norm. So we're going to discuss in further detail about how this applies in organizational leadership and how this could be a possible moral issue in the country. Studies show that nearly a quarter of Japanese companies require employees to work more than 80 hours a week of overtime. Another Expedia study found that on average, Japanese workers did not use their full 10 days of vacation, and 63% of Japanese workers felt guilty for taking paid leave. In 2013, a Japanese journalist died due to congestive heart failure after recording 159 hours of overtime with only 2 days off in the month prior to her death. The journalist died with her cell phone in hand. The practice of being overworked to the point of death is so common in Japan that there's an actual word, karoshi, that translates literally to death by overwork. So now we're going to use this example, this moral dilemma of chronic overtime in Japan, and we're going to put it in a situation, as an American manager or an American leader facing this moral dilemma in the host country of Japan. We're going to use the Garrett-Ross decision-making method, which is we're going to look at the moral reasoning, the moral dilemma, and ultimately we're going to make the moral decision. So first we're going to identify the relevant stakeholders. In this situation would be the employees, it would be the employees' families, and it would be the company's shareholders. The stakeholder interests, we're going to identify those. For the employees and their families, would be their health and their well-being. As far as the shareholders, it would be losses due to sickness, death, etc. Step 5, looking at alternative actions. From a government standpoint, there are laws that prevent chronic overtime, and the alternative action would also be for punishment for the companies for violating these laws and regulations. Also within the company itself and the government would be awareness and education regarding the dangers of chronic overwork. As we saw on the previous slide, many of the Japanese workers felt guilty about taking time off. So a lot of this is just ingrained in the culture of the people themselves. They feel like they have to work this massive amount of overtime in order to please the company and to provide for their family. So continuing on with the moral decision-making method, we're going to step into step 6 here. We're going to look at the pros and the cons of the alternative actions that we looked at. So the pros of laws and regulations and awareness of this chronic overtime would be a better physical, mental, and emotional health, and increased worker productivity. There are studies that show that the more you work, there's like a threshold there that you actually lose productivity, and there's data from the G7 that actually shows that Japan is one of the lowest countries in regards to worker productivity, and much of that is due to just being exhausted, of working this much overtime. And also for the companies, it would be lower health care costs for the employer. If their physical, mental, and emotional health is better, then it's going to by all means reduce health care costs. The cons would be the costs, especially the initial costs associated with transitioning to a shorter week for the employees, and it would be also penalties and fines for companies that aren't complying with laws and regulations in regards to mandatory overtime, and also paying the people for the overtime. That's another issue that's come up in this dilemma, that not only are they working this amount of overtime, but they're not getting paid. They're not getting paid the time and a half or the proper wages for that. So as we move into the latter steps of this of the moral decision-making method, we're going to look at step 7. We're going to look at these conflicting moral principles, these Ross and Garrett moral principles. We're going to look at honesty, fidelity, which is basically the commitment to the shareholders for making a profit. This is in conflict with the moral principle of non-injury. It's also in conflict with the moral principle of harm prevention and respect for rights. In this particular case, I would say that non-injury would override at prima facie, that non-injury would override the moral principle of honesty and fidelity, and also, harm prevention as well would override that. And moving into step 8, the applicable principles, also we see non-injury and harm prevention, but we also look at, the hypernorms, the primary goods, that this violates one of the primary goods of well-being, of the general health and well-being of the employee. So now we come to making the actual decision. What is the preferable action in this circumstance? In this example of an American manager, an American leader, and Japan actually facing this dilemma of chronic overtime. So, the first action would be to have both government and company regulations regarding the amount of labor hours that can be worked. Also, strict penalties for violating these regulations, both from a government side and from internally, from internal management. To have penalties for workers who willingly violate the regulations, and also for management that either force them to work it or allow that to happen. And then increase the number of internal audits and labor inspectors, just to be able to regulate the regulations in regards to this. So now we move into the second moral issue or moral dilemma that a manager or an organizational leader could face, in the host country of Japan, would be in regards to gifts, business gifts. Gift giving in general is a part of the cultural norm in Japan, especially, even in business. So, part of the act of gift giving is the emphasis is more on the giving itself more than the gift. The value of the gift is usually irrelevant. The dilemma here is that lines can get blurred between gift giving and bribery, especially for an American manager, an American leader who's not used to this this culture. The lines can get blurred there. The EODC, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, it's an international organization that helps to build policies. It says on the website that the goal is to shape policies that foster prosperity, equality, and opportunity, and well-being for all. So there's different countries are part of the EODC. Japan is actually one of those countries, and the EODC has this kind of universal guidelines in regards to gift giving that help to clear the lines between what's acceptable and what's not acceptable in regards to gift giving, what's actually gift giving, and what constitutes for bribery. So we'll look closer into that. All right, so once again, we're going to follow the Ross-Garrett decision-making method. The moral, what's the moral reasoning, what is the moral dilemma, and ultimately what will be the moral decision. So step 3, we identify relevant stakeholders. In this case, it would be shareholders, it could be business owners, suppliers, customers, potential customers. It could also be even government officials. It could be family members of all parties. And the interest, the stakeholder interest on the negative side would be to avoid any legal ramifications. It would also build healthy business relationships, build rapport with customers and clients and future clients, and also to through these relationships to generate new business and create profit for the shareholders. So what are the alternative actions? number one would be to incorporate gift-giving guidelines into the actual company policy, and as we discussed earlier, to follow the actual EODC gift-giving guidelines. So what are the pros and cons of these actions? The pros would be to build rapport and relationships with potential clients, to understand the culture, to participate in this local norm and this local tradition, which would ultimately help to generate new business and or reinforce existing business. The cons would obviously be, if you're not familiar with with this process, what is legitimate, the legitimate norm, and what could be also viewed as bribery, and at the extreme case there could be possible legal ramifications if there were any type of bribery or wrongdoing there. So step 7, what are the conflicting moral principles we're looking at here? We're looking at the moral principle of gratitude, which is really the act of gift giving, is to show thanks, versus harm prevention. Also, the moral principle of honesty, fidelity versus harm prevention, and beneficence versus harm prevention. So in this case, it's really kind of it's hard to say at prima facie which one would override the other. It would have to be in the context of the actual situation itself. If it is within the legitimate norm of the company, I would say that gratitude would override harm prevention. And also, if this helps to build relationship and rapport, and it's within the the confines of just relationship building, then honesty, fidelity, this would definitely help to create new business and help draw in future clients. And it would also be beneficence. It would be sort of with gratitude, showing goodness to someone. Even the with the host country of participating in this local norm. So the step 8 applicable principles would be complying with the legitimate norms of the host country. Also would be exercising the primary goods of autonomy and rationality, and the applicable principle in the on the other extreme, it would be harm prevention by not participating in something that in gift giving that that if you were able to distinguish that it was that it wasn't legitimate, and that it was to be seen as some sort of bribery or wrongdoing. So, wrapping up this last moral dilemma in regards to gift giving in Japan, based on going through the moral decision making method, where the dilemma, the moral reasoning, the moral decision that we're going to come to in this example would be to follow the EODC guidelines. And this part of their guidelines is this: they have this acronym for gift. Is the gift genuine? Is it in appreciation for something? Is it something that I've done in my role as a public official and not requested or encouraged by me? Is it independent? If I accept this gift, would a reasonable person have any doubt that I could be independent in doing my job in the future, especially if the person responsible for the gift is involved or affected by a decision that I might make? Is the gift free? If I accept this gift, would I feel free of any obligation to do something in return for the person responsible for the gift, for his or her family or friends or associates? And is it transparent? Am I prepared to declare this gift and its source transparently to my organization and the clients, to my professional colleagues, and to the media and the public generally? So this comes straight out of the EODC, and this is their guideline. They're saying if it's kind of pass the litmus test, of the gift using this acronym, and it's a good it's a pretty good indicator of whether it's in the acceptable guidelines, of the local norm, of the legitimate norm, the hyper norm of that country, or not. If it doesn't kind of pass this litmus test, and that would help you to to practice then the moral principle of harm prevention or non-injury would override. But this is would be a good way, especially that this is an international organization and the country of Japan does participate in the EODC. So this wraps up my presentation. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've learned some interesting facts about Japan and what kind of moral dilemmas a manager or an organizational leader would face in that country. Thank you very much.